Well, hi everybody. Sorry about the hat and the really rosy cheeks and everything. It's Monday and a student emailed me and I totally forgot to record the Chapter 17 review. And I'm usually on my stationary bike exercising by 4:30 in the morning. And when I get done, I hit my desk up here and I got the email and went, so you got me at my best. Still got my hat on, kind of got the red cheeks from working out. But anyway, we're going to look at Chapter 17, the performance appraisals, or appraising performance. This is a real point of contention for me because I do a lot of training in this area with companies, and I just don't understand why we can't figure out how to do it better. So if you were to ask yourself, when was the last time you had a performance appraisal, and was it any good? Did it motivate you at all? Because it's supposed to be a motivational tool. We don't really understand that. They give us this formal little description here. We're in Chapter 17. It starts on page 484 in our supervision book. And they give us the formal definition of formal feedback on how well an employee is performing on the job is known as a performance appraisal. And it goes on to say, or a performance review or performance evaluation. So there's a lot of different terminology out there. I know some companies that actually even call them coaching sessions. They don't even use the word performance evaluation. But the whole purpose here is to look at the criteria for the job of what you're supposed to be doing, right? And then measuring that against what you're actually doing, right? Your performance. And then it's a gap analysis, really. It's like, okay, then where are we? How big is the gap between what I really want you to get done and what you're actually doing? And then how do we fix it, right? How do we remedy the situation? So they look at, they want us to look at this systematic approach to performance appraisal. And they give us on top of page 487 the little boxes, the diagram, the little flow chart. And it shows us that in this particular book, because believe me, there's 101 different ways to do this. This is the 4-step model. Establish and communicate expectations for performance. We don't do that very well. For some reason, we think that job description we hired you for does it all for us. It doesn't. And a lot of those do not even get updated for years sometimes. So your job may have changed. You're not even doing the same job as was listed when you were hired, because let's say just because of technological changes, a computer added to the system or whatever, software. But we don't necessarily communicate what it is that we really want you to do. So we have to be very careful about this. This is about that whole goal setting thing. So if I don't know what the goals are, how am I supposed to work towards them? Okay, if we don't have that conversation. Remember our little action plans and setting goals and all of that good stuff? Well, that's what you need to do. A simple little action plan can really help an employee, work towards something and then have a deadline, just kind of like homework. If I didn't give you a deadline, what would happen, right? And then the second part of this, establish and communicate standards for measuring performance. We don't do that well either. We use the most basic and simple of the different types that are available, and we're going to go through those because they show us some examples in the book. But a lot of people really don't even understand what they're getting measured against. So it's like, well, how did you decide I did well? Or how did you decide that I did poorly? The third step, observe and measure individual performance against the standards. Well, we're supposed to be keeping track of this stuff, right? And this is my biggest problem. We have this yearly performance evaluation, right? And everybody hates them. You hate them, the supervisor hates them, the employee hates them, everybody hates them, they dread them, right? It's like all of a sudden you have 40 people to evaluate at the end of the year. Let's do them once a year. That's brilliant. It's not. You're supposed to be having these conversations throughout the year so that when you get to, observe and measure individual performance against a standard, I should be having weekly, daily, monthly conversations with you about where we're at, saying, listen, this is what you're doing really well with, but here's where you need a little bit of work. For me, the performance evaluation should be a summary. At the end of the year, we sit down together, no surprises, and we sit down and we summarize all the work we've done throughout the year. Right? So we can say, wow, look what you've accomplished throughout the year. We had these beginning goals and look where you are now. Well, here's some that we didn't necessarily meet the goals or meet our expectations. Let's look at why, because there's a lot of circumstances or extenuating circumstances that might affect that. And it should just be a summary. It should not be a surprise. It should not be a 2-hour meeting. It should be a get together to know where we're going for the next year, really, and to say thank you, that kind of thing. And of course, then the last step, they're talking about reinforce performance or provide remedies. We're horrible at that. We don't necessarily reinforce the good behavior, and then we don't necessarily offer ways to remedy something that's not working well. We need to have those conversations. So, but with this, at least with a model like this, you could use this model throughout the year. It doesn't have to be done at the end of the year. Then they get into, the reinforcing performance and providing remedies. They talk a little bit more about this because this is critical. How are you going to do that? Guess? You can't guess. And you should be keeping your documentation. Documentation, documentation, documentation. I'm serious. Because when you get to the end of the year, you need to have that conversation. And if something needs to change and they are not willing to change, and you're looking at putting somebody into your company's disciplinary model or the steps for that or whatever it is, you need the documentation to show us, where did we start and where are we now? So you really need to have really good organizational skills, good management skills, good leadership skills to be able to do this. Now, on the bottom of page 488, they give you, and this is a short list, but this is a pretty good list of things for you to look at if someone's not maybe performing up to your standard. Now, remember, I just said your standard. Is your standard the company's asking for? Are you a type A crazy person that expects perfection? But the company's willing to accept, 80%. So you have to be able to prove that they're up to a certain standard that's on the books, okay? That may differ from your standards. But look at this, inadequate skills. Do they need more training? Lack of effort. Are they just simply not putting in the effort? Shortcomings of the process. This is huge. We never pay attention to the process. Sometimes we're doing things we don't even remember why we're doing them. Well, and you ask them, they go, well, I don't know. We've done it that way for the last 20 years that I've been here. Well, that's just the way we've always done it. That doesn't mean it's the best way, right? So look at the process. See if it's a shortcoming in the process, not necessarily the person. This goes back to the 80-20 rule. Well, I don't remember if this book talks about it. Probably doesn't. Anyway, and then external conditions. If you have worked in sales since 2008, what has happened within the economy? That might affect your performance. That's an external condition. And personal problems. Now, we'd love to say that we don't bring our personal problems to work, right? I've heard a boss say, you leave that stuff at the door. That's just silly. Get over it. That is not the way it works. Anything that happens to you in your personal life will affect your work life. If you lose a parent, have a great loss like that in your family, or anything like that in your family, lose a pet. Even we forget how important our pets are. What if you have an accident? I mean, this stuff affects your work life. So you have to be cognizant of this as a good supervisor to figure out, okay, what's going on here? Let's try to get to the root cause analysis. Gosh, you hear me say that all the time. If you're in any of my other classes, you hear me say it all the time because we don't try to get to the root cause. We look at symptoms, but we don't look at the cause because we can't fix things until we know what the cause is. Ooh, this is really weird stuff here too. Page 489, this whole new trend in performance appraisal, social media style. So read that because it's very interesting. But what catches my attention, what I have highlighted is towards the end, the last paragraph, is because they are so informal and immediate. Social media applications function well as an add-on to more traditional systems for performance appraisal. This might be just an additional way to look at things. I would be very, very careful about this being your only way because we know how social media works. Now, what to measure? Obviously, we're trying to measure behavior and results, that kind of thing. And they go on to talk about the legal part of this, which is on the top of page 490. Figure 17.2, qualities of effective performance appraisal measures. They need to be objective. You don't get to say words like, you're always late. That's not true. If they were always late, they would have never showed up for work the entire time they were on time, the entire time they worked there. Well, I actually did meet an employee once that was always late, but that's another story. So you have to be very specific. It has to be job related. It has to be based on behaviors. It has to be within the employee's control. related to specific tasks, and communicated to employee. You can't reprimand people if they don't know what they're being reprimanded for. That goes back to those first 2 steps in that 4-step model, doesn't it? But this is the legal side of this, because if you fire someone, Wisconsin is Wisconsin is a fair hiring and firing state. We do support a legal good, it's called a good fire. It's a legal firing. But they will come in and look for these things. These things will be examined because that's the legal part of it, for it to be a good fire. So it does talk a little bit about the EEOC guidelines, performance appraisals and pay reviews, that kind of thing. That's pretty basic stuff, but just, review that EEOC guideline part of it, because they will look for the legal side of things and making sure it was a legal fire. Now, different types of appraisals. If you've had jobs and had appraisals, you've noticed that if you went from a different job, they're using different forms. There's no one standard, and companies often use the one they've been using for the longest time because they don't necessarily investigate, find a new one or the best one. The one of the most frequently used is the first one that they talk about on page 491, is a graphic rating scale. And that's where it's like on a scale of 1 to 5, they have these different job listing, job description, or behaviorals. And then it's like, how did you do from a scale of 1 to 5? Pretty basic stuff. Paired comparison approach. Be very, very careful with this kind of approach. This is when you're ranking employees against one another. That's not necessarily a good idea for multiple reasons. I mean, when you start ranking people against one another, it goes against everything we talk about for team building. But also then you have to be careful about some of those EEOC and legal guidelines, okay? So be very, very careful about that. You can see on page 492, they give you an example of the typical graphic rating scale. Sometimes they don't even have numbers on them. In this case, look at outstanding, good, satisfactory, fair, unsatisfactory. To me, that's useless. What is unsatisfactory? I mean, unsatisfactory might mean one thing to you, but it might be fine for me. So it's going to be extremely subjective by supervisor. So be very careful about that. Of course, and always keep in mind too, and I know it's really hard because you won't necessarily ever have input unless you get into HR on what you should use and what you shouldn't use for performance appraisal tools. It's something that's generated through your HR office. A lot of times, the rest of the company is not involved in that. Forced choice, that one's now you're getting a little bit better as a measuring thing. It does force you to choose. They give you an example of that on the bottom of page 493, and it does help prevent a little bit of the leniency bias. Essay appraisal, that's again a much higher level position. You're not necessarily going to be asking your frontline employees to write you an essay. This is going to be for higher level positions. Now, you have to also be careful here too, because you may be very, very knowledgeable, but what if you're not a good writer? Which you guys have bumped into in my class, haven't you? How do I get the information to Rox on the paper that she wants that's well written, right? It's very hard because we're not all naturally great writers or have been taught well. I mean, it's a skill that we're taught. Behavioral ankle rating checklist, you guys can read that. Critical incident. Now, on page 495, critical incident appraisal. You have to be very diligent if you're going to use this kind of appraisal. This is when we're actually looking for and recording incidences. Now, incidents, generally, that word has a negative connotation. But you can't, it's called building a file. If you only put the bad stuff, the negative stuff in a personnel file, if you only keep documentation of that, it's called building a file. It's illegal, okay? And building a file also applies to if you're adding stuff after the fact. That's the biggest part of building a file. Ooh, I'm really mad and I want to fire this person. I'm going to go back 2 years and start listing everything they did. That's building a file. Can't do that. Okay. So you can record the negative incidences, but you have to also record the positive incidences. And we would talk more about this in my legal issues class, because here's what the judge asks you. He says, okay, I'm looking through this. I mean, did this employee do nothing well? They've been employed with you for 9 years. They've done nothing well. Why are they still with you? Where's the good stuff? Because they had to have done something well to stay employed here up to this point for 9 years or whatever it is. Okay. Work standards approach. That one, it's kind of what they did, what they should have done. That one's pretty basic too. Management by objectives. That's an old, and we were studying that back in the 80s. I'm old. But we were studying that back in the 80s. And that's kind of, and I like the methodology, but the real traditional form of it is very cumbersome. It's long, it's complicated, so people quit doing it. But basically, if you had an action plan with some goals on there and you talked about what you wanted to work towards next year, that's basically the idea behind it. Management by objectives. Let's set some goals and objectives and work towards that throughout the year. And at the end of the year, let's sit down and summarize that. Doesn't that seem logical? 360-degree review. I would love it if everybody did that, but it's costly and it's time consuming, so most companies do not do it. That's where you would not only be judged by your supervisor, but also by your peers. It's a 360 review. Anybody, you know, anybody and everybody that works with you would get to praise you, and vice versa. You get to praise your bosses too. So there's a lot of fear with that, so we don't often see that. Now, sources of bias. On page 499, they give the little wheel. This is extremely important for you to understand. You need to read every one of these very, very carefully because you do not know you're doing them. These are subconscious things that are happening inside our little heads that we don't know we're doing. So they're not malicious in most cases. We don't necessarily realize that, you know, we're using central tendency where, you know, we just want to skip, we just give everybody a 3 out of 1 to 5. Well, I'm just going to give everybody a 3 because, you know, I don't really want to, oh, up or down. Oh my gosh, you know. These are all little things that happen that we're unconscious of. For example, let's say you have your highest, best performer employee and you rate them and you're just all rosy and happy because they're just so fabulous, right? What happens if the mediocre worker or the worst worker comes in next? Now, oh, there's a huge gap. Now you can have what's called harshness bias. Leniency bias. So read these through. Similarity bias is very, very interesting. We will overlook things that people do if they are more like us. It's like, well, you know, I could see these are little things in your head. You're not saying them out loud necessarily, but your little brain's processing, thinking, well, I might have done that in that same situation because, you know, they're a lot like me. And of course, I'm fabulous, right? So how could it be bad? Halo effect, different prejudices and stereotypes all affect, you know, how we rate people. So we have to be very, very conscious of it. If I was you, I would make a little copy of this wheel of bias, and I'd have that. If I'm involved in performance evaluations at all, I would be studying that prior to the process at all times. I would have that visible. The interview, purpose of the interview, that's pretty straightforward stuff. You know, basically, don't rush it. Be prepared. Be professional. You know, don't be confrontational. You don't sit down with someone and say, okay, now we're going to rip it up from last year, right? You make sure everything you talk about is relevant, job-related, good communication skills. You know, seek their input. If you can, or if your HR is not doing it, if you can, ask them to use self-evaluations where the employee gets to rank themselves before they come in. And then, you know, and HR will have a list of things that you would do is you would have them sign and agree that everything's done. And of course, the follow-up part of it, which is most people don't do that well. But they give us a nice, nifty little model here on the bottom of page 503 on how to, you know, conduct the performance appraisal interview. And you can read through those steps. And that pretty much takes us through the chapter. It's a huge, huge topic. It's a huge area of study, and I would really, if you're going to be in a leadership or supervisory position where you're going to be responsible for rating people and which affects their lives, their jobs, and their ability to get other jobs, you should be as well versed in it as you possibly can, beyond what HR is asking you to do, okay? Well, I think that wraps up chapter 17. Oh my gosh, we got through the whole book, everybody. Have a good day.